So Ioannidis before said usually lawyers are not invited to these tech conferences. I have to tell you that in the next panel, apart from an MEP, I have three amazing tech lawyers, and you'll see what I mean as soon as you hear them. But before I introduce the panel, we have an address from Dr. David Casa, who's also an MEP, who couldn't be here with us, but we do have his comments about the subject. Once we see this quick video, as soon as we see this quick video, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll start discussing the topic. Can we bring on the video, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's conference, and thank you to the European Parliament office in Malta for addressing this very timely topic. One, I believe, is on the forefront of Maltese industry and Europe policy making. There is much to be said for the potential of artificial intelligence and blockchain. They have stormed the international market, and they have captivated the attention of those in finance and financial technology. At the EU level, there are some efforts to invest in the research and development of these sectors. There is still a significant gap, however, with the level of investment being made in the US and China. That is not to say that Europe is shying away from AI and blockchain. From my perspective, close watch is being paid to ongoing developments, and this is informing efforts in regulation. It has to be said that there are as many risks as there are opportunities, of course, and currently there is substantial political momentum to regulate these new industries. But, of course, we must also avoid over-regulation. From the perspective of the European Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, there is ongoing dialogue to seek a healthy balance between various interests at play. On one hand, commercial interests favor growth. Even here, we see the desire to have legal certainty. We need a framework that is certain, but one that directs growth rather than raising too many obstacles against it. Citizen and consumer interests need not be on opposing ends. Of course, we need to protect citizens and consumers from gross negligence and malpractice, but we also need effective safeguards and enforcement against criminality. It is ultimately in everyone's interest to have these standards, and I believe they can help innovation and promote application of these technologies in a variety of existing industries, all while protecting end users, of course. It is new technology. It is being used on an unprecedented scale. We cannot predict every risk, of course, but we know what Malta's weak points are. The risks associated with money laundering are one of particular importance. From a regulation perspective, there is much catching up to do. The digital sector has become an important part of the Maltese economy, so there is expanded scope for legislators to enter into dialogue with industry leaders. This is the best way to remain up to date with development, to continue identifying risks as they arise, of course, and to propose ways of addressing them in the most effective way, of course, and that maintains the best balance of interests. These technologies promise important solutions to current issues, including sustainability, and there are various sectors that can benefit from innovative uses of AI and blockchain, but we first need a framework that encourages this. If we want the private sector to invest in technologies, that we need to first ensure this robust framework that encourages the industry to grow sustainability, to grow securely, and to grow in a stable manner. Malta has huge talent in the financial sector, and these professionals deserve a cautious but confident approach. We can avoid mistakes with careful policy making, and I believe improving the confidence in these new technologies can lead to innovation and ultimately in economic growth. There is much potential for new jobs, and Malta has a strong track record of professionalism and competence that makes it very well placed in Europe. This already attracts clients from all over, and it will enable other sectors in Malta to utilize them and innovate further. As members of the European Parliament, we are duty-bound to contribute to the policies upon which this sector will rely. This means, of course, that keeping close contact with industry players. We must work together to learn from recent lessons, not to neglect the risks, and to ensure that the hard work of our professionals is not undermined because of regulatory failings. I wish to thank EPL Law once again for this conference, and to all of you for your work and your attention. I wish you a productive conference, and I remain available for further cooperation in any way I can, both as an MEP, but also as a long-standing member of the European Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the European Parliament.
Thank you to Dr. David Casa, MEP, for his address. And as I told you now, I'm going to introduce the panels. Another MEP on the panel, 3 tech lawyers, and a representative of the Malta, the MFSA, the Malta Financial Services Authority. So, starting from our MEP, I'd like to introduce on stage Dr. Josianne Cutajar. We also have Dr. Ian Gauci, partner and partner at GTG Advocates. Dr. Joseph F. Borg, partner at WH Partners. And Dr. Jackie Mallia, senior associate at GVZH Advocates. And last but not least, Camille Pepos. He's the deputy head of the FinTech Supervision at the Malta Financial Services Authority, MFSA. Yeah. So, thank you for coming. It's an amazing panel. I'd like to start immediately with our MEP on stage, Josianne. I'd like to ask you about the AI Act. I'd like to understand more, and I'd like to our audience to understand more. What is this AI Act all about? So before we mentioned like the EU's general approach, but there is this AI Act which is very pertinent. Even something is happening today, apparently, on the AI Act in terms of. So I'd like to understand first. What is this AI Act, and maybe a bit its impact as well. But let's start what it is, what's happening at the EU Parliament in terms of the EU Act.
Thank you, Johan, for the question, and welcome everyone. Thanks also for EPLO for this organization, along with AIBC. And it's very pertinent at the moment to discuss legislation on artificial intelligence. As we all know, artificial intelligence is already with us, but as we go by, it's fastly evolving, and we know that there are some risks that we need to regulate. And therefore, as the European Union, we decided that we should have harmonized rules and legislation on AI, on trustworthy AI, because if we don't have trust in this new technology, then who will suffer? The market as a whole, because there won't be enough uptake by customers, but also the professionals who are using it, who may not have some legal certainty about it. And the big debate going on at the moment, even earlier this week, I had the opportunity to participate in a Euractiv panel relating also to the impact on SMEs is, are we legislating early, or are we restricting innovation, or are we already a bit late? And I, as a lawyer, so let me declare a bit my bias, I do believe that legislation and legal clarity is important. And here we're speaking about a technology which impacts fundamental rights. I won't repeat because I've already heard a bit what the other panel said, but it's really important because there's also this classification by this draft AI Act, which is still being negotiated. There are trialogues in between the Parliament and Council at the moment, where they are discussing several provisions, and hopefully by the end of this year we'll have a better final position. But what's important is that this act also defines several categories according to the risk. So there's the high risk, for example, AI, when it comes to medical devices operating in operating theaters, which have an impact on human life. There's also high risk on other critical infrastructure. And when there's high risk, this AI Act will impose certain obligations relating to transparency, documentation, traceability. In all of this, we need to have human-centric rules regulating AI, whilst, however, also incentivizing innovation. And as we heard earlier on in the panel, there was reference also to these regulatory sandboxes. And I believe that these are important, because there needs to be some safe space before a product goes into the market where our innovators, our researchers, our investors have this safe space to also innovate, because otherwise we cannot be at the forefront. And AI has a lot of benefits apart from risks, because AI can also address and give solutions with regards to some aspects which we already have as challenges and haven't yet addressed. I wanted to refer a bit now to my work. At the European Parliament, I was negotiator on behalf of the Socialists and the TRAN committee. And for those of you who are wondering what ITRE and TRAN are referring to, there are two committees within the European Parliament. ITRE relates to industry, technology, research and innovation and energy, and TRAN to transport and tourism. And in the TRAN committee, we gave an opinion where we contributed towards this AI Act. And there I emphasize that apart from having clear rules and a just market, we also need to make sure that our SMEs are placed on a level playing field when it comes to competition and evolving AI solutions. And therefore, one of the aspects which I pushed forward, in my opinion, was that SMEs should be given, for example, priority access to these regulatory sandboxes. There's a lot to say on AI, but for sure, what we also need is skills. It's important to have legal clarity. It's important to have ethical and safe AI, but then we also need the skills needed for Europe to be at the forefront of these technologies. And with this regard, there are also other supporting instruments, such as the Digital Decade, where I was negotiator on behalf of the Socialists, where we're putting forward 2030 targets in relation to skills, digital skills, and also the field of AI. I'll stop here for now, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Josianne. Ian, I have a million questions about what was said and about what Josianne just said. But let's start from this AI Act again. I would like to understand a bit more from your point of view. I know where you're coming from, but I'd like to hear your opinion about this AI Act, about its impact, about whether the EU is in the right direction.
Let me first distill what was said on the AI Act. Distill, give it a purpose, and give it a dimension.
Perfect. That's what I...
You can't look at the AI Act in isolation. It's part of a larger plan. So let's start with the AI Act. The AI Act is quite a unique piece of legislation for various reasons. Aside from the fact that we're regulating technology, technology does not do harm. It is the individual. The design of the individual in technology, the use of the individual in technology, or the misuse of technology by the user. It is there where the harm occurs. So technology on its own is a means to an end. It's a tool. And this is precisely why the AI Act was formulated. So to a certain extent, the AI is unique because we are defining AI, which is very abstract, okay? It is going to regulate narrow AI, general AI as well when it is tied with high-risk AI, generative AI, which is very topical right now as well, okay? It's already regulated through data protection. It is unique as well because aside from regulating, it has a plethora of regulatory captures, which are unique. And why unique? The AI Act stems as a prudentiary legislation. So prudentiary and risk. Prudentiary because we have sandboxes which are meant to be free. They are meant for SMEs. In the sandboxes in the last iteration, you can as well test real-time environments. And I have to emphasize that in the Act, the AI Act, there are specific provisions to protect the users, even on consent, even on how their data is going to be used. So even there, the legislator planned a priori for that. Okay? So you have sandboxes, you have specific measures for SMEs as well on certain provisions. Then you have ex-ante measures. Ex-ante measures, as the MEP was saying before, if you have a classification of low-risk AI, high-risk AI, and AI that is not captured, okay? So let's start with high-risk AI. High-risk AI, you have ex-ante measures because you need to do conformity assessment, and they are split in two. Conformity assessment on AI, which is already, because AI is a horizontal layer, regulated in other industries, automotive, in years to come, it will be as well a lot of things in the transport industry, machine industry, medical industry, those are already regulated. Conformity assessment there will need to be done by a conformity assessment body. Then you have conformity assessment for high-risk AI, which is not already regulated, which will be done by the individuals. And there's a specific annex on that. Aside from the fact that there could be as well high-risk AI pertaining to human rights, because it's tied with human rights. Then you have AI, which is not per se risky, okay? If it's not regulated, even in that case, and this is quite unique, there is a co-regulatory approach. Why? Because the EU is pushing, and this is voluntary, that there need to be code of conduct there. So that is the AI in a nutshell. It's very complex, but it is very broad and unique as a piece of legislation because you can take parts from the product safety, but you don't have direct liability and direct redress mechanisms, GDPR. So it's a vast piece of legislation, but it's part of a larger structure. We're approaching the digital economy. So in the digital economy, even AI, you have data which is required. The EU was already regulating data. It is already. You have data protection, GDPR. You have the Data Act. You have the Data Governance Act, which regulate and which touch not only on data, personal data. So we have movement of data, which is so important as well for AI. The EU is also regulating infrastructures as we speak and platforms. You have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, okay, even on the competition side. So even there, they are regulating the infrastructures, the platforms. They are regulating cybersecurity, which is of fundamental importance, okay? Because even cybersecurity as a horizontal layer, the EU, so you're seeing this is part of a plan. The EU has the Cybersecurity Act, which is already in place. There is the Cyber Resiliency Act, specifically on IoT and wearable devices, and it will touch as well on smart toys. It's quite a vast piece of legislation. These are all in the pipeline right now. They're not enacted as yet. So even there, that is done. They're addressing as well part of the liability. So there is a reiteration of the products directive, the second one, which will touch specifically on software. It can touch on AI, and it will cater as well for the massive lacuna on updates, okay? So it can be captured as well. You have the AI liability directive. There is currently a consultation document on that. That is non-contractual liability. So what we lawyers call tort-based liability. So as you can see, there is a structure happening, and the AI happens to fall right in between that. Now, one last minute. Initially, I was very skeptical, and I have been following this right from the inception, commenting for government, for the authorities. However, the AI Act, there was, I think, a very wide and open collaborative effort. Commentaries, authorities, industries, academics. And what we have right now, even though the definition is still a little bit technology-oriented to a certain extent, I think it's something we can work with in the future, particularly with the other pieces of legislation. And I think the mental here is the EU, similar to what happened, and it was mentioned before, under GDPR, in all these pieces of legislation is not caring that much on what America is doing, on what England is doing. There's a consultation document right now on what Israel is going to do, and they are replicating what the UK is doing. They want to set their course. Why? Because they want to have a trustworthy digital economy with the user protected, based on something normative, which is human rights. Very important. We're no longer speaking about ethics. We're speaking about human rights here. Secondly, they want to be a leader in the field. And the EU right now is not a leader. So this is part of the plan as well. So within that context, I think that Europe has a place to play. Malta, we need to be vigilant, because we have a lot of legislation coming in. We're a small country. Capacity-wise, we are limited. Knowledge-wise, we are limited as well. So we need to coordinate the efforts between different authorities. There needs to be a coordinating entity coordinating the efforts, because we are going to underpin more regulation on technology and automation in a lot of different fields. So there needs to be coordination between different authorities. And aside from that, we need to start thinking as well, and I will stop at this, our economies of scale dictate that we start thinking about super regulators. We don't have it right. Otherwise, we'll have legislation, super regulators, and good strategy, because we always play the fundamental part. We still need to be significant in the European field, and that requires planning.
Thank you, Ian. I'll move on to Joe. Of course, I would like to hear your comments about like the previous, 8 panelists. There was a lot, but I have maybe a personal question from what I've heard, and maybe one that the audience would be interested in. I work a lot with startups. We had an AI system. We tried to ask about certification. It's a startup, and the numbers already went into 70K, 80K, 90K, 100K. When I looked into really big AI, to get some compliance, it could be 400K. This is just an example, but all this that we've heard in terms of innovation, in terms of all these acts, and are we actually creating an innovation killer, or are we as EU, as Malta, are we maybe we say that we're pro innovation, but then what we're creating is actually an innovation killer? I'd like your opinion, but you can also comment on previous.
You actually anticipated my thoughts, because as a former regulator, I'm quite controversial and quite atypical, and I consider regulation a necessary evil.
Okay.
But it should only be there when it's really necessary also. So one of the problems that listening to Ian speak, it's all nice and sort of logical, but at the same time, with all this regulation, how can a startup survive? And ultimately, what we're seeing as well is we're having a lot of operators moving to other parts of the world because Europe is no longer feasible. But they still manage to offer their services in Europe. So we're creating a disadvantage to all operators that are actually established here. Now, let me go back to my first statement. Regulation is a necessary evil. Don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have regulation. We have seen in recent events, especially if we look at blockchain, we have seen with the FTX saga that regulation is necessary. And there's no way that these industries that are so complex, that handle players' money especially, or that deal with, or that could impinge on the fundamental human rights of people like AI, definitely some sort of regulation needs to be there. But we should be guided by principles and objectives. And as long as those principles are followed and those objectives are achieved, I don't think we should go too much into detail in regulation, especially in technology fields, because technology is constantly changing. Business models are constantly changing, and we need to let this happen, because that's how innovation will happen. if we are becoming too prescriptive, and that is my fear about Europe, we are going to be in a situation where we're going to either stifle innovation, which regulation will always stifle innovation a bit, so it is understandable, and it's not necessarily wrong, but at the same time, we're pushing away a lot of businesses that, rather than becoming the region of choice and becoming leaders in this, we are going to make ourselves as the last people on the planet on this. Because operators will not come and spend all that money to get regulated.
Thank you, Joe. I'll move on to Jackie. We've heard a lot, and we've heard about data protection a lot. We've heard about where we're going in terms of that AI is creating intelligent digital brains that are, at some point, some of us believe that are going to become more intelligent than humans. From what you've heard, in terms of the data protection and surveillance, and also in terms of machine sovereignty, what are your thoughts about these two aspects? Of course, they are broad, but I'd like to start from that.
Sure. So, Johan, I get the science fiction question, it seems.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the previous, I think, 9 panels, but it fell on you. I wanted to. Sure. I cannot do 2 panels about this and not ask about singularity or something like that. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, obviously, singularity, sort of, just to explain a little bit, is the concept where kind of the machines come to a point where they take over, you know, the human race, basically. To the extent, that, I mean, AI is basically, it develops itself. It's kind of the idea behind AI systems are that they actually develop themselves, they take decisions on their own, and they start to sort of develop and grow and grow and grow. Now, the theory is that at some point in time, there's going to be this like explosion of intelligence where the machines are actually going to be so intelligent, and obviously they are much better at processing information and much faster at processing information than a human brain. And that means that they're going to get to this point where they're going to overtake potentially the human race, or anyway, there are these theories. Now, will it get there, will the technology actually get there at some point in time? Obviously, is anyone's guess. There are theories that yes, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, there are people who are absolutely certain that this will happen. I cannot tell you because I'm not a technologist, I'm a lawyer, but what I can discuss is maybe, to what extent does regulation that we have at the moment cater for this possibility?
Are we just regulating for the immediate, or are we planning of what could happen? By having autonomous cars is the nearest thing that we're going to have running in our streets. But exactly. There are other things. But are we regulating for now, or are we, with this AI Act, are we future-proof?
Well, I mean, I think it's very early to be able to say that the AI Act can actually cater for such a situation. I mean, like I said, we're talking about, circumstances that could occur in 30, 40 years' time. Although it's possible that it might happen earlier, we don't know. But this is, I think, the crux of the issue, that we don't really know. In particular, with this kind of technology, it's very, very hard to anticipate where it's going to go, even generally with technology. But when you have a system that actually builds itself, then it is very difficult, obviously, to anticipate how far it can go, what it can achieve. We're talking about a situation where the technology can come to a stage of like a black box. Even the person who developed it doesn't know why it is taking decisions in a certain way. Okay, so I mean, this is why sort of there's this whole concept of, robots taking over the world and all of this stuff. Ian posed a comment before where he said that technology doesn't do harm. Agreed. So far, apparently there's the potential that it can eventually. And so, okay, to come back to your question, can we cater for that right now? I think we are trying to cater for what we know at the moment. I think there are concepts like, for example, explainability of the AI. So there are rules that require you to require the developer, for example, to always be able to explain why the system took a decision. And for example, this is one rule that we have in the EU, even under the GDPR, actually. There's this prohibition against automated decisions that can't be explained. But it always comes back to the usual question. Yes, I mean, is this going to stifle innovation? Obviously, it probably will, because, I mean, if you have a country where they're not expecting you to be able to, explain how this decision was taken by the system, then obviously it's easier for the developer to develop there without these restrictions. But then on the other hand, I think as a country, one needs, or as a region, one needs to also discuss, sort of as a matter of policy, to what extent, do we want to innovate, but where do we pull the plug? How far is too much innovation? And at which point do we lose control? And I think the whole point of singularity is this point where you've lost control and it's irreversible. So I think definitely we need to make sure that we don't get to that point. So although we try to not stifle the innovation, I think we need to make sure we don't get to the point of uncontrollable and irreversible development that we've lost control of.
Thank you, Jackie. I see you all looking at me like, give me a sec. Let me get a comment from Camille first. Camille, you represent here the Malta Financial Services Authority. In terms of Malta has a big financial industry. With it strives ahead through the years in terms of regulation. What are maybe the lessons that, so now we're discussing emerging technologies, blockchain, AI, other things. But we do have a history and we've learned a few lessons. And maybe even what happened last week with FTX, it's not related to Malta, but definitely there is a lesson there. But in terms of MFSA, can we actually learn from, I would say, from the mistakes, but also from what we've done in the past and use it to have proper laws and regulations and policies for emerging technologies? Camille?
Yes, sure. So what have we learned? Obviously, I speak for blockchain, and with what we saw last week, I think it's easy for me to say, we told you so. There's a need for a set of rules, regardless of the technology and what industry you operate in. What's interesting to learn, and almost this FTX collapse could be used as a case study, is the technology has not failed. What has failed here is corporate controls, or the lack of. So the position that was taken by Malta and the MFSA at the time in 2018 to develop the framework to regulate virtual assets, the operation, introducing some requirement in terms of internal controls, having risk management, audited financial statement, all of that is still very valid today. It's even more valid today. We're seeing exactly why we needed to do that. But I do take the comment of my co-panelist. It can stifle innovation. This is always going to be like that. It's a catch-up game. The regulator is not going to go faster than the market. But another way to look at it is, and you're in the startup world, so you know it, startup need capital to grow. Capital from especially institutional investor is never going to pour unless there is regulation. Agreed. An institutional investor is not going to invest in an unregulated activity. Agreed. Or something potentially that is illegal. So there's another way to look at it. With proper regulation, proper control, obviously the level of confidence is increased, and the capital that is injected in the industry is increased. So in a way it also helped the innovation. But we've learned some lesson. 2018 in the blockchain world is 3 decades ago. The world has completely changed, but we have the same legal framework. So as regulator, we need to find ways how we can accommodate those new trends, assess them, understand the risk, and then have an adequate policy decision. So for example, we open a sandbox. I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but this is a tool for a regulator. If we want to protect consumer, we need to understand the risk first. So there's a bit of an education. We need to allow some experimentation, understand the risk, and then we can mitigate them. When we manage to mitigate them, then the tide lifts all boats. The industry goes better, there's more capital, everyone is protected. So I guess this is the lesson learned. You need a basic set of rules, but you need a bit of flexibility and some room for experimentation, understand the new trends, because technology is always going to go faster than the regulator.
Thank you, Camille. I saw Ian and Joe, but before, I know that you wanted to comment about something about what Jackie said, because you were looking at me. But before that, I'd like to have Josianne's comment about what you've heard. Obviously, we're speaking about the regulators. How are we going to get from the laws and regulations that come from the EU Parliament and implement them through a regulator in the various EU states, and then their impact on citizens and businesses. But over to you.
Thank you for giving me the floor also, because I need to leave a bit earlier, unfortunately, because it's a very dynamic discussion, and it's great to have different points of views, even challenging each other. That's always a great debate to have. Yes, so I took some notes from what all of you said. And yes, I do agree that we need to demystify AI for people to understand it more, if we need to have the trust. And to have that, we need also the skills. So we need to have the know-how, we need to explain it better, but we need also the skills at basic level, at the workplace, for example, but also at more advanced skills. If we really need to be at the forefront as a European Union, we need to invest in the skills of those who would develop AI too. Then, when it comes to the liability aspect, which is also very much important, there will be a proposal from the Commission that we'll be working upon. As the European Parliament, we already did the own initiative report, which also instigated this Commission proposal, and there I also had the honor to work in the TRAN committee on the opinion on these civil liability rules, which I really, really enjoyed, because my background is a lawyer, so it's great when I have this opportunity to also contribute towards upcoming legislation. And this is very much important, because at the moment there is a lacuna in the law of this AI embedded, if there's AI embedded within, for example, a vehicle, and this vehicle hits someone and causes damage, who would be responsible? Will it be the developer? Will it be the user of the car? We don't know yet. It's unclear, and this is very much important to have legal clarity, both for the investors, but also for the users and the passerbys who are impacted by this AI-driven car, who may not be aware of it. And in this regard, yes, the aspect mentioned by Jackie, traceability, is very much important. And as the European Union, focusing on this human AI-centered approach, we also, in this opinion that we developed, also included this importance of traceability back to a human being, so we'll be sure that when it comes to liability, there's always this traceability to have rest of mind assured. Then when it comes to startups, SMEs, there are some provisions in the AI Act being discussed, which relate to startups and SMEs. And this is very much important, because we know that the costs that they face and incur, especially while this technology is still fast evolving, is huge. And to have them have a better level playing field, we need to have some positive discrimination, some differentiated approach, but not only within the AI Act. And for this, I also mentioned that we need other assistance within the European Union in general. I mentioned, for example, state aid rules and revising the de minimis threshold, which would be important even for our startups and SMEs, but also funds, EU funds, making them more accessible and making it easier for our startups and SMEs to also be able to get to them, because they are there, readily available, but sometimes it's too complex for them to navigate through this complex set of rules and regulations. And in this regard, Horizon Europe funds are much important, but also regional funds, which take stock, for example, of the fact that startups and SMEs coming from an island member state like ours have already inherent additional handicaps which they face, including, for example, the access to financing. Then, when it comes to the importance of avoiding double regulation, as Ian mentioned earlier on, there are sectors such as transport where sectorial legislation already exists. And that's why also in the opinion of TRAN, we included an aspect that we should really be careful not to double or over-regulate in this regard. And this AI Act is intended to be a horizontal regulation, and therefore where there is sectorial legislation involved, such as in transport and healthcare, we need to make sure that we don't impose an additional burden with extra rules when the sectorial legislation is already there. And then the last point I wanted to bring into this discussion, but which is also very much important, is the importance of continuing to monitor the impact of legislation that we enact. A legislation isn't something fixed. The law changes over time, especially when it comes to a fast-evolving digital environment. We need, as policymakers, to be on the constant lookout in consultation with all stakeholders, whether it's industry, whether it's researchers, to make sure that where there is the need for amendments, we do so effectively. It's true that technology will always be ahead of us in this regard, but it's our responsibility to be agile too, as much as the process allows, democratically, to also evolve our legislation. And finally, this whole discussion revolves around the delicate balance that we constantly need to achieve, which is not easy to achieve, between innovating and fostering development and also investment in this AI field, and regulating and legislating, on the other hand, to make sure that there's a trustworthy and safe environment where fundamental human rights and also EU values are not compromised.
Thank you, Josianne. Ian, I saw you looking at me.
No. I actually, one point.
Yeah.
Regarding, there will be overlap in legislation. Product liability, even the liability regime, we already have strict liability when we have automated vehicles. So there, with strict liability, it's not fault-based, strict, and you need to have insurance.
Okay.
Okay. So there, the question will be: will you regulate AI, or will you enhance and open up more the already existing legislation? But we will have. What I was disappointed when the AI Act was done, because we're speaking about no overlapping. The nebis need them. So the nebis need them. You're going to have AI, which in certain instances, a breach under AI would be a breach under GDPR. Okay? And it was acknowledged, but it is only mentioned in the recitals. The nebis need them. It's not mentioned in the Act. Now, otherwise, I agree. On what Jackie said, I agree thoroughly. One point. The AI Act, as it's covered right now, as the MEP rightly pointed out, is based on human centricity.
Agreed.
Even traceability is there. We have it even in our legislation. We have the forensic node. AI has the same principles. If you're a high-risk AI, you have governance, you need to keep the logs, even the representative is liable as a distributor or producer, similar to product liability. So the legislation is not perfect, but it caters for that. It does not cater, however, for science fiction, because as Jackie rightly pointed out, for the time being, that is science fiction. One last point, your comment. I agree with Joe. I come from the regulatory point of view. I advise regulators. However, under the AI Act, contrary to FinTech, where you have the reverse solicitation, where somebody who's not licensed in the EU can indirectly tap European subscribers, AI Act, similar to GDPR, we have what is called the Brussels effect. And that can't happen. Why? Because if you have a high-risk AI, okay, for the high-risk AI, at least the ones which come after the Act is in place, because for the past ones, that's another big lacuna. They are not covered unless they have material changes. But for new AI, unless you get certified, unless you have conformity assessment, unless you have CE, you will not be able to distribute that product within the EU. If you have a company who is not tapping the EU, but it's European, and is doing an AI output in Mexico, they will still need to abide with the AI regulation, similar to what we have under GDPR. Okay? If you have a foreign company, being it American, Japanese, Mexican, tapping the EU market, okay, they will need to appoint a representative, they will need to, so in that case, that is siloed. The risk, as Joe mentioned, is very real, but the risk could be, under this act, we are framing risk, we are framing harm, and we're building legislation around that. And that indirectly is also amplifying on the definition of AI. That is the major risk that we'll have.
Thank you, Ian. Really final comments, because...
Well, I wouldn't like to be taken as a person who is against regulation, so I reiterate the fact that I am pro-regulation as long as it is effective and also that it is objectives-based. And in my opinion, this extraterritoriality, for example, of GDPR and so on, it is a good thing because at least whoever wants to attract business from Europe will have to adhere. But is it happening with GDPR fully? Are you still receiving spam emails constantly? Is there any authority that can actually take action against these spammers who we don't even know from where they are spamming? So let's be careful with this. Creating extraterritoriality, it also has to come with the possibility of actually enforcing it. And I'm not so sure that enforcement outside of our territory is so easy to do. It is easy against the big companies, yes, and the big companies will simply either say it is worth it for me to get into you and comply with their regulations, or they will say I won't comply and pay the fines, or else they will say I'm not going to target the EU and I'm going to leave the EU out completely. And that is another risk because we can become second-class citizens in the world. So I believe that balance in regulation is crucial, and to achieve balance, as Camille said, we need to learn first on what the risks are, on what we want to achieve, all right? And then we can regulate properly, and maybe yes, sandboxes could be a solution, but also going with a certain level of regulation at first, and then adjusting the level of regulation as the need arises, as we learn. I think that's much more effective.
Thank you, Joe. I see that Dr. Josianne Cutajar has to leave us.
I'll get an update later on what was discussed. So rather maybe than overlapping, yes, it's better to speak about avoiding double regulation. And yes, it's important also the points of the balance that we need to achieve. And one last point, maybe the other speakers could comment too. We're living in a world, so we must also look, yes, at the legal legislation and standards being developed elsewhere, including in the field of transport. Thank you, and have a remaining fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Josianne. Thank you very much. Final comment.
Very final comment. No, just picking up basically on what we were just saying here and what you asked me originally, which is sort of, are we prepared? I think my final comment would be that going forward, when we're looking ahead 30, 40 years and the potential of these kind of technologies, I think that regulation can no longer remain regional. I think it'll eventually have to be global because, you know, technology, you cannot regulate. I think regulating technology regionally is only partially effective. You know, when you have a technology, it can affect you in very covert manners. So the fact that it is developed abroad, you know, under less regulated situations, means that it can still affect you in Europe, even though Europe is more heavily regulated. So I think eventually law needs to start becoming a bit more global rather than regional or just country by country.
Thank you, Jackie. Camille? All right, let's start the weekend then. So, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for my panel, starting from Josianne Cutajar, Dr. Josianne Cutajar, MEP, who just left us. But We also had Ian Gauci, Joseph F. Borg, Jackie, and Camille. Thank you very much.